You
I'm
have
so
very nice,
sorry. I'm so sorry I'm late.
well, we're used to meetings starting before, on time, and after, so you fit right in.
Well,
Um,
not
so
that bad.
we'd like to welcome you and all our participants to our conversation on defending democracy in the digital age. So I'm Sherry George with the League of Women Voters of Alaska, and joining with the Leagues of Maine, the Leagues of Alaska and Colorado have collaborated on to offer over 20 seminars over the last 2+ years. And we've covered topics like facing the challenges of AI, how trends get turned into reality, election interference, the Silicon Valley tech coup, and most recently, we hosted Professor Latanya Sweeney on technocracy and how technology will dictate our civic future. So today, we're pleased to have Michael Tomasky join us. He's editor of the New Republic. The New Republic was founded in 1914 and covers breaking news, politics, climate, culture, and the arts using an online platform that publishes daily and weekly online newsletters, offers podcasts, virtual and in-person events, and a full-featured magazine. So, hey, he's not a busy guy. But in his spare time, he's also authored 5 books, including his latest, The Middle Out, The Rise of Progressive Economics, and A Return to Shared Prosperity. He's also a fellow in media and public affairs at George Washington University.
Well, this is
Uh,
Anne. I think Sherry's Zoom link went down. So I know she was getting ready to finish that introduction. I hope she comes on in a minute so she can, pick up where she left off. But in the meantime, I think, Michael, we're here to hear from you. So
okay,
without further ado, maybe we'll just let you say what you have to say because it's been a week, Michael. It's been a week.
sure. Hi, everyone. Um, I hope Sherry comes back. Um, it's really nice to be with you all, and I'm grateful to be invited, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation. So, Sherry wrote to me and said that people were interested in the piece that I wrote after the election about the rise of the right-wing media over the years, and she said that the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. Of course, I understand that, and never supports individual candidates, but uh, it we do see a great danger to our democracy when we lack a shared reality, and that's pretty much what that article was about. So I think I'll talk about it in those terms, and I'll talk till about 5:30 or so, and then I hope we'll have a robust conversation about this. It's an issue that I think about every day of my life, being in the media and being the age I am. I'm 64 years old, so I've been doing this for a while. Um, and I've watched this media landscape change over the course of my career. So let me just go back and do this. Actually before my career, but within my lifetime, let's say. I'll go back that far. So if you go back to the 1960s, we had a very clearly shared media reality in the United States, didn't we? We had 3 networks, and they all operated according to sort of basically the same news gathering principles. And we had a few major papers, still the major papers of today, generally speaking, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Uh, and and then you had the wire services and a handful of other things. But those properties that I just mentioned constituted at that time what we might call the agenda setting media, which is to say they set the news agenda for the rest of the country. I remember when I was in college, I had a professor say to me, and he knew this from experience, that every night the front page of the New York Times, the next day's New York Times, went out to front page editors around the country. And they, with respect to national and international stories, they pretty much did what the New York Times did. If the New York Times decided it was A1 News, then it was A1 News in the Des Moines Register and the New Orleans Times-Picayune and everything else. Um, and that was the power of those key media properties in those days. And this was fine with most people, except for movement conservatives. The conservative movement didn't really quite exist yet, but it was just starting to gather its troops, so to speak. In 1969, there was a guy named Reed Irvine who founded an organization, a conservative media watchdog organization called Accuracy in Media. And he was the first person really to raise a right-wing critique of the mainstream media that it had a built-in liberal bias. So he went around to editors at the New York Times and the Washington Post and CBS and NBC and everywhere else and tried to explain this. And they listened to him in some respects, didn't listen to him in other respects. I think he probably had a point in certain respects. We can get to that in the conversation period if you wish to. But I also think that by and large, the media in those days took seriously the proposition that they existed to challenge power and to challenge authority. Now, you can call that a liberal thing if you want, but it's a journalistic value, and those are two different things. They look like the same thing, I guess, to some people, but they're two different things. So, a classic example of this happened in 1968. I'm sure some of you remember it. Walter Cronkite was America's trusted voice. Everybody didn't watch. Some people watched Huntley and Brinkley. A few people watched Peter Jennings. But Walter Cronkite was America's newsman. And you may recall that in early 1968, he went over to Vietnam for the first time to see for himself what was going on there. And he came back and reported what he saw, which was that, in his view, this was not a winnable war. And within weeks, the war dropped 20 points in popularity. Johnson dropped many points in popularity, Lyndon Johnson. He shortly thereafter said he couldn't run for re-election. That's the kind of power somebody like Cronkite had in those days. And this irked conservatives to no end. And I'm sure that episode was one reason that Reed Irvine formed his group. Fade in, fade out. As you go through the 1970s, conservatives started to commit to the idea that we are never going to get a fair shake in the mainstream media. And so we need to build our own media. So here were a couple of signal moments along that timeline. Rupert Murdoch got his first property in the United States late 1976. He bought the New York Post. He subsequently had to sell it once, but then was able to buy it back. Owns it today, as you know. And Murdoch completely remade the New York Post. It had been a liberal newspaper to that point. It was a liberal, pro-New Deal newspaper until 1976 under its previous owner. And Murdoch immediately turned it hard to the right. Also made it trashier. Probably not a coincidence in my view, but a side point that we can save for another time. And then Murdoch bought more properties as time went on. In the early 1980s, the Washington Times started up. This is the conservative paper in the nation's capital, still exists, still going strong. I think, well, going strong is in the eye of the beholder. It loses many millions of dollars, but it's underwritten by the Unification Church, once owned by Reverend Moon. It became, with Ronald Reagan's election, it became important. The Reagan administration fed the Washington Times stories instead of the Washington Post sometimes. And so Now the conservative movement had a strong media foothold in the nation's capital. Um, then you had, in the later Reagan years, the demise of the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine dated back to the 1930s when the Federal Communications Commission came into existence. And the FCC, in its early days, decided these radio stations, there was no TV then, of course, these radio stations exist on frequencies and they're granted licenses by the government. So if we're going to grant them license, we're allowed to make some rules about how they need to broadcast news and public affairs. And so the Fairness Doctrine held that for every minute they spent on liberal views, they had to spend on conservative views, and they had to devote a certain amount of time to news and public affairs broadcasting. The Fairness Doctrine came under attack from the right, beginning in the 1970s. Finally, by late in the Reagan era, it was gone. That opened the door for right-wing talk radio. And so Rush Limbaugh was the first of those. But he was the first, of course, of many. Now, I have to say, in all fairness, they found an audience. They found a huge audience. I don't think there were similar attempts to do liberal talk radio back in those days in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But if there were, they obviously didn't succeed. And these right-wing shows did succeed. Then in 1996, you had the Fox News channel. And that obviously was a big event. I'll stop there, but there have been more steps along the way, particularly in the internet age. And then just more recently, an explosion of podcasts and TikTokers and social media influencers and things like that that we all learned something about in this last election. In my view, and I've been asked to speak about this to a number of groups and in a number of places, and nobody's really ever quite disagreed with me. In my view, this was the first presidential election, in which this right-wing media, which has grown and grown in these steps since the 1970s, actually became the agenda setting, not the New York Times and the Washington Post and CBS and NBC and ABC. Fox News, Newsmax, One America, Sinclair, which owns many, many local radio stations and local television stations, and is now getting into newspapers. iHeart, which is the new name of former Clear Channel, which owns a lot of right-wing talk radio networks. There are two Christian radio networks that own also vast networks of programming. And then throw in the podcasters and the TikTokers and the social media influencers. It's a vast armada of media properties that today do more to set the news agenda for this country, for our politics, than the New York Times and the Washington Post do. I don't think any of you would disagree. Joe Rogan influenced and changed many, many, many more votes than the New York Times editorial page, which probably didn't change a single vote. So that's where we are, and the realities that these two medias present to their readers and listeners and viewers, to get back to the original point, are strikingly different realities, as I'm sure you know if you ever check in on Fox News at all, even for 10 minutes a day. You can see it's just a different planet that they're talking about. But it's influential. So, for example, in this election, that story about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, eating dogs and cats, never any evidence that there's any truth to that whatsoever. It started on X, Twitter, by some guy, got noticed, got picked up, went viral, started to get picked up in the right-wing media ecosystem. And then finally, J.D. Vance mentioned it, and then Trump mentioned it at that debate. And then at that point, of course, or even earlier, um, the mainstream media needs to react to a story that the right-wing media has created, you see. So that's what I mean by agenda setting. And the right-wing media much more often sets the news agenda than the mainstream media on that story, on stories like the flooding, Helene, I believe it was, in North Carolina and other southern states before the election, shortly before the election, when the story popped up in the right-wing media that Biden and Harris had diverted money that was intended for flood victims to undocumented immigrants. Not true. Based on a smidgen of a kernel of a iota of something that was true, which was that there is a line item, a budget line item in the FEMA budget that goes to border, measures in some way, shape, or form. But it's not the disbursement of that money. The spending of that money had nothing to do with disaster relief money. A whole other pool of the FEMA budget. But there was 2 weeks. Kamala Harris took your money. And if any of you are in North Carolina, I don't know if you are, but I read that there were many, many ads on radio and targeted at in social media people who lived in North Carolina uh, that that Harris took your money and spent it on illegal immigrants. Just not true. So that's where we are, and it's bad not only at campaign time. It's bad all the time. It's bad right now. Um, if you watch MSNBC or CNN, you're seeing a number of commentators accurately, in my view, say that the Trump administration broke the law in firing, for example, those inspectors general. I don't see how anyone could say otherwise. The law is quite clear and unambiguous, right? The law says they have to give Congress 30 days notice. Uh, they gave Congress 0 minutes notice. They didn't give Congress 30 seconds notice. So they very clearly broke the law. But you're not going to hear people say that, I don't think, very much on Fox. Um, or if they acknowledge that the law might have been broken, they'll say that it's a law that needed to be broken and it needs to be tested, and Trump needs to take it to court and get that law undone. Um, so we're in two different realities this whole time, and it makes it very difficult to be one people, one civitas. Um, I mean, there are a lot of people who don't pay any attention at all to this stuff. Right? I mean, even Fox, at its best, draws a few million people a night, um, and MSNBC and CNN obviously less so. So the vast, vast majority of this country is just tuned out of these ecosystems in the first place, and they're watching basketball or celebrity stuff or whatever they're um, streaming whatever Netflix, whatever the hot thing is. But it's enough that it 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 keeps us apart. I mean, I still am on Facebook, and I use it to be in touch with old friends, and I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, and it's West Virginia obviously has become a very right-wing place. Morgantown is the home of West Virginia University, so it's a little different. Um, Kamala Harris came close in my home county. It's the only county in West Virginia that was remotely close. But I hear a lot from my old high school friends, most of whom are conservative, some of whom are liberals, and they thank me for what I'm doing and the fight I'm trying to keep up. And the conservatives come on there and say, "Oh, Tomasky, what's happened to you?" And they just the things they say, I can see that they're living. I wrote a thing about Trump's pardons of the J6 people, and a bunch of people came back and said the unconscionable pardons were the Biden pardons of his family. Now, I don't necessarily defend those pardons, but I don't think they really compare in terms of historical gravity to the pardons of people who were insurrectionists against the United States. Um, so that's where we are. I don't see. I'll just finish by talking a little bit about whether there's a way out of this, whether there's a more hopeful future. I don't see it right now. Um, I mean, we're not going to go back to that time, to a time when there's a Walter Cronkite. We're just not. Um, the country is too divided and will remain that divided and become more so, I think. I mean, if anything, my position, given my political views and where I work at an avowedly liberal publication, is that I'd like to see wealthy liberals do more of what wealthy conservatives did starting in the 1970s and cede more media properties, um, particularly in the heartland. Liberals are a little too obsessed with, well, the places where they live and hang out, the coasts chiefly, and Chicago to some extent. And, this has been, has had disastrous consequences. I don't, this is not just the fault of rich people. This is a problem that has many fathers, but, you know, uh, in vast swaths of the country, uh, there's not even no liberal media. There's no mainstream media. There's hardly anything but conservative media, and so it's small wonder that Democrats can't get elected in these places. I was just thinking back when I was a young reporter. Uh, the two senators from Tennessee were Democrats. The two senators from my state of West Virginia were Democrats. Uh, Two senators from Georgia, I think, were Democrats. The two senators from North Dakota were Democrats. Nebraska, two Democratic senators. These are places where they'd almost never elect a Democrat to the Senate today. So there's a big job ahead of Democrats and liberals in terms of just repairing the reputation of their brand in vast swaths of the country. And that's a media problem. I think that's a media story. Um, so I think unfortunately, this problem will continue for quite some time. And finally, I you know, the social media is makes everything worse along these lines, because these algorithms at Facebook and other places reward rage and conflict. And now Facebook has canceled fact checkers. Um, so I don't know. I'd like to find an upbeat note on which to end my little presentation, but I can't really find one, except to say this. I mean, somehow, we we do still have uh, we do all is not lost. I mean, there's despite the media dominance of the right, they don't have the same kind of political dominance. Donald Trump won the election, but he barely won, against somebody who was only the candidate for 107 days. Um, and I think most Americans uh, don't subscribe to that view of the world, but uh, it's a fight that is just going to play out in many ways over these next 4 years and beyond. So thanks for listening. I hope that was interesting in some way, and I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Um, yes, it's very interesting, and I guess we were hoping for, the what are we going to do next? And
Yeah.
you'll see a number of the questions here reflect that, and so it sort of boils down to, what could we as individuals and potentially our organization do to try to make a difference, to try and get either there's more balanced number of outlets to where there may be a middle of the road, the Chet Huntley, David Brinkley era, where everyone watched the same news. What do we do to try and move in that direction? You indicate it'll take a while to get there if we can get there. Um, it's like, what steps do we start taking now to help us move towards a more shared reality, or at least the opportunity for a more shared reality of with fact-based reporting? How do we start trying to move back to that in that direction?
Well, support the outlets that do that. Support the New York Times. They make a lot of mistakes and have a lot of flaws, but they do some great reporting, and they're a very necessary thing. Um, Supporting the Washington Post is a tougher call at this point because you all know it's not just that they pulled that endorsement, that Bezos pulled that endorsement of Harris. It's that they hired a guy who was a Murdoch guy in London and was implicated in the phone hacking scandal, and they lost 300,000 subscribers uh, when that endorsement thing happened, and some prominent people have left, like Jennifer Rubin, who's a terrific columnist there, just left to form a new thing on Substack with some other people. But I would say still, on balance, the Washington Post is a force for good. Support local journalism that's honest. I mean, one positive thing that has happened is that there are a number of local nonprofit new news organizations that are popping up that aren't liberal with a capital L, and that's great. Actually, they shouldn't be. They should just be news outlets reporting news, informing the public in their regions, and doing the traditional duty of journalism, which is going after the powers that be, and you know comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, to use that old cliche, in which I still believe. And these are popping up all over the country. I don't know, if they're in all of your states. I know in my home state, there's a very good one called Mountain State Spotlight, which I support. Again, it's nonpartisan, it's nonprofit, but at least it's doing really good reporting and holding public officials in that state accountable in ways that the newspapers just aren't quite able to do so much anymore. So that is the one positive growth thing that I've seen is a number of local nonprofit news organizations. There's a thing called Courier News, which is trying to do this in a number of states, uh, and so I just support that as much as you can. Support the best thing you can do if you want to support journalism is, I guess, to support your local, diligent, nonpartisan journalism.
Well, we have a question here. You mentioned Substack. So the question is, what are your thoughts on the Substack source for information?
It depends entirely on who the writer is. I mean, Substack features many journalists who have left their old traditional news organizations and struck out on their own and are making a living. It's great for that. And there are a number of social scientists and economists and people like that who are on Substack who are offering very trenchant and fact-based analysis. So it just sort of depends on who you're reading. You should always go Google them and read about them and see what their credentials are and see if you think you can trust them. But yeah, signing up for Substacks, as long as you've vetted them, is a really good thing to do. It's given people voices who, might not have had voices at other places. I mean, I know that at the New Republic, I have an editorial staff of 15 maybe, and I post a job and 70 people apply for the job, and maybe 50 aren't really quite right for it, but 20 are pretty good and 10 are great, and I can only hire one. So what are those other 9 or 19 people doing? Maybe they're on Substack. So there's a lot of quality out there.
This question had come in before this presentation had been emailed to us. It sort of relates. And what do you think of Blue Sky? You mentioned, Twitter or X earlier. So, what do you think about Blue Sky and its reach?
I'm all for it. I mean, I joined it sometime last year, and I found that I wasn't at first paying that much attention to it or going on it that much. And now I spend more time on Blue Sky than I spend on X. And it's still I still have more followers on X. But when I post something I write to both places, I find that the engagement on Blue Sky is just better. It's just higher quality. I mean, of course, more people agree with me, so that's nice. But it's not just that. It's that there's just there's just a kind of depth of engagement that is better. Now again, we're just splitting into two camps, and pretty soon X is just going to be right wing and Blue Sky is just going to be left wing or whatever, and you know that's where we are. But there's something to be said also for just being within a like-minded community at times of stress and duress, and having that level of sort of emotional support from others.
Yeah, well, in that vein, we had an earlier question. How do we get people out of their silos? I'm reading this question. So, how can we persuade ourselves and our fellow citizens to listen beyond an echo chamber?
Yeah,
Is there a way?
I don't know. I don't know that there is a way. I mean, I think that's very hard. I mean, we can try to listen to other points of view and read other points of view, and I do. I mean, I read. I don't watch much Fox, but I do read some conservative outlets, and at least to know what they're up to and to know what they're saying about things. But I don't. It's completely predictable, to me when I go look at this website, The Federalist, or this other one called The Daily Caller. I gotta say, I don't find anything on there that's particularly interesting. And they probably say the same thing of the New Republic when they come to the New Republic. Um, so there aren't that many things that are kind of in the middle that have a little something for both sides. I mean, like the Atlantic has conservative writers, but it doesn't have any pro-Trump conservative writers. You know, the Atlantic is, I guess, as close as you're going to come to something that sort of mixes viewpoints, but they're of one viewpoint on Donald Trump.
Yeah, to go back to your earlier comment, I just spotted this one question. Could you share some of the names of those new nonprofits that you were talking about?
Oh, well, I shared a couple. There's Courier News
Courier.
is
Yeah.
trying to have a nationwide reach. They don't have it yet, but they're building toward that. Um, I mentioned my Mountain State Spotlight, but if you're not in West Virginia, you don't care about that. There's a really successful one called the Baltimore Banner, a relatively new nonprofit news site devoted to Baltimore. Uh, there's a good one in New Jersey whose name I forget. Um, uh, there's something called Heartland Signal, which covers a few states in the Great Lakes region. Um, so you would just have to do a little Googling if you live somewhere else, and just I would just Google, nonprofit uh, news sites in blank wherever you live, and uh, and see what comes up. There are a number of them out there. They don't have magnificent budgets. They have a few reporters, most of them, um, but they do well. They all almost all punch above their weight.
Okay, this one's I think is a very interesting question and a little bit different than we've had. How are the journalism schools addressing the points being discussed and understand about its possible physical location? I mean, it could be dependent on where the university or college is, of course. But have you been? I think you teach at George Washington, and maybe others. So, what have you seen in higher ed journalism schools? What are they trying to help the journalists of the future, plan
Yeah, yeah,
for?
it's a great question, and I'll admit that I don't really know that much about the answer to it. I do teach a class at George Washington University. I just started this semester. This is the first time I've ever done it. I'm an adjunct, obviously, and I'm teaching a class called Persuasive Journalism. I'm teaching them how to write opinion pieces. Um, and uh, I don't really, I haven't spoken to the dean at the School of Media and Public Affairs about how they're addressing these questions. I know a little bit from my home state, from West Virginia University, where they spend which actually has a pretty good journalism school that is not, it ain't Columbia or Northwestern, but it's good for the amount of money they have and the endowment that they have, and they do a pretty good job of trying to keep students up to date on how they have to be like multimedia, multitaskers. And I think that's probably a common approach in a lot of journalism schools that they're teaching students how to do that. How to do social media, how to do traditional media. How to just do everything that a journalist has to do these days. I don't know how they approach the questions of bias. That's going to happen. That's going to be very different from place to place. It's obviously going to be approached differently at NYU than it is at the journalism school at the University of Missouri.
This is now all these questions come from all different directions. So this one is, do you have any concerns that the New Republic and like-minded media will be targeted?
Sort of. I mean, I don't think the New Republic is quite big enough a fish, to be honest. Um, unless we may get some scoop that we run that really makes this White House mad, and then we get in their gun sights. I mean, they know who we are. They know we exist. I know that, and obviously they're not fans of ours. Uh, but I don't think they count us as quite important enough. I do worry certainly about larger outlets, and these networks have broadcast licenses. that the government can attempt to yank. Now that's not true of cable networks because they don't have a broadcast frequency, so they don't get licenses from the government. But it is true of networks, CBS and NBC and ABC. And you better believe that ABC executives were cognizant of that fact when they recently settled that matter with the Trump administration for $15 million. So yeah, I worry about that kind of thing a lot. And like arresting journalists, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't put anything past this guy, but on what basis? Um, I don't know. There may be some obscure 1837 law that I don't know about that they do know about. Um, but I worry in general about a silencing of some larger outlets, a partial silencing of some larger outlets, and then of others silencing themselves, which we've already seen to some extent when we see Jeff Bezos kill an endorsement editorial of the opposing presidential candidate and then donate $1 million to the inauguration and attend the inauguration. That's a kind of self-silencing. Doesn't mean the Washington Post is never going to write aggressive stories. They are, and they have, but they might be fewer and farther between.
We've had one of our participants here, Heidi, would like to ask you a question just online. So if she just unmutes, she can pose her question.
Yes, I'm very concerned about the haves and have-nots within the digital divide, and that the people that are Trump people are probably not going to be trying to sign up for all these Substacks and all that sort of stuff. And I'm just concerned, what can we do to help level the playing field for all journalists? Because it seems like this isn't working because it's not getting the all points to all people. And, and I also want to see journalists get paid a living wage on, if not more than a living wage, because it's more like a combat thing these days. They should get combat pay. But it just seems like we've got to think beyond the box in terms of coming up with new strategies for what we can do to fund journalism. Is there anything that anybody is talking about at all about this?
Well, I've talked to some people who have some interesting ideas about things that they want to try to do. Um, breaking into breaking into journalism at a level to have a certain amount of national impact is still a very expensive proposition, and you've got to plan on losing money. You aren't going to make money. I mean, you might, but most journalism properties don't make money. The New York Times makes money, really for one reason: Wordle. I mean, that's the main.
What
There are
about
other.
centralized journalism? Like have a fund that is national, that gets divvied up to a lot of different people, a lot of different outlets of diverse kinds of coverage.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I would support. It's something that I've suggested in print before. I mean, I've been at this, Heidi, everybody, for like
Okay.
20 years. For 20 years, I've been trying to say to rich liberals whose ears I have from time to time, and I've been trying to say to them, you aren't paying attention here. You think the world revolves around the New York Times and the Washington Post. It does not. And in the future, that's going to be even less true. And if you don't invest in media today, you're going to be overrun. And I'm wrong. I'm wrong about a lot of things. I was wrong about the election, and I've been wrong about a number of things in my career, but that I was right about. And it's just going to take it's going to take a number of people uh, to see what a big problem this is.
Yeah, here's one that's also a little bit different. Does anyone else have a sense that this is from Roy Horvath, does anyone else have a sense that a lack of consistent civics education and critical thinking skills contributes to the lack of similar understanding of how our governance system is supposed to involve each of us as informed and participating citizens?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's another thing that I've written about a good bit over the years. And the demise of civic education is a tragedy. Um, it's something that isn't solely the fault of conservatives. It's liberals have let civic education die too in many ways. Um, and this is a huge problem. Uh, and in my book before this last one, I had a section about that and how civic education could be revived and should be revived, and where it exists, which isn't everywhere, but where it exists, it's 1 year or one semester. It should be 4 years. It should be every year of high school. There should be some different aspect of civic education. Now, will they teach it differently in Alabama than they do in Vermont? Yeah, of course. But, at least if it were there, that's a start. It's a starting point so that people at least agree on, the basic facts of what our system of government is, because we don't have agreement on that right now. So it's extremely important and something that not enough people pay attention to and take seriously.
And here comes one about the White House press session yesterday. It says the White House is opening up credentials to social media outlets. Two that were mentioned were Anxious and Breitbart News. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I can't object to that in theory. I'm not a fan of Breitbart News. I don't know what Anxious is. I can guess. But, you know, a line has to be drawn somewhere that it is a news gathering organization, that it's not just some person, sitting in their proverbial basement mouthing off. That's not a news gathering organization. Breitbart meets the definition, I suppose, of being a news gathering organization. If Kamala Harris were the president and some liberal TikToker wanted to be credentialed at the White House, would I object to that in principle? Probably not. So if I'm being fair-minded, I should be fair-minded enough to say that I don't think that it's in principle a bad thing. I have a feeling how it's going to turn out with this White House is that 15 conservative such outlets are going to get credentials and no liberal ones are, so that's probably how that's going to go. But I think the definition of what constitutes the media these days has obviously changed quite a lot. And I don't, in principle, have a problem with the White House keeping up with that change.
Do you think there's anything that, because our organization is, based grassroots, it's based locally and then state and then a national organization. So many of us work with our states or individual states and legislatures. And do you think there's anything that could be done at the state legislative level to help keep let's say, more media alive than is being done now, or to protect reporters and what they're trying to do, and how they speak out one way, or either left or right?
Well, I don't know about supporting and sustaining media. I think in terms of protecting reporters, sure, state shield laws can be strengthened. The laws that protect journalists from having to reveal sources, for example, vary widely from state to state. So, I'm sure they can be toughened up in many states in ways that would defend journalism. Uh, it's not so much a legislative thing, but it's something that um, it's something that a governor uh, could maybe help make sure that a certain station gets a nod from the FCC, things like that. Things that are done, these kinds of things are more done unofficially. Um, I'm thinking back to the time when, unfortunately, this is not a good example. Think back to the time when Democratic Governor Mario Cuomo helped Rupert Murdoch repurchase the New York Post. Not his finest hour. Anybody, is Sherry frozen again?
Yes, this is Ann. Sherry is indeed frozen again. Um, how are we doing on time? We've got maybe time for one more question. And so I'll ask a question that I had. We had
Okay.
these recent defections, Paul Krugman from the New York Times, Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post. Does this seem like a general devolution to you or a continuing devolution of the so-called legacy media? Like, is this the beginning of a massive regrouping, and where does that end?
Well, yes and no. I mean, no, because the New York Times, is not bereft of talent because Paul Krugman left. Paul's been a pillar there for a quarter century. But the New York Times got Ezra Klein. Uh, I hope some of you read Ezra. He's very talented, and he's going to be. I've known him since he was in college, and it was very apparent. I gave him his first job, in fact, and it was very apparent to me that he was going to be what he has become within like about an hour of meeting him. And he's really good. I think Jamel Bowie's really good. So I don't think all hope is lost at the Times by any stretch of the imagination. I think a lot of the folks there have been there a long time. I'm not putting I'm not putting a term limit on them, but uh, there's going to be a lot of turnover on that page in coming years. Uh, a number of people have been there for a while. I don't need to name their names. So we'll see what that brings. Um, so it's not necessarily bad. But I will say this, though, with the options like TikTok and Substack, particularly, uh, and other options, a lot of journalists don't feel they need to be at the legacy media anymore, and so that means that there are just a lot more talented people out there on their own who we may never have heard of and we may rarely hear of, but who are really good, and you got to go seek them out. And this just happened yesterday. Some of you may have noticed. Did anybody notice the story about the Office of Management and Budget memo about freezing federal spending? Did anybody notice who broke that story? A young woman, I can't remember her name because I hadn't even heard of her. But a young independent Substacker who has no big affiliation, and she's been around for a little while and has a little bit of a following. But she seems to have broken the story before the Washington Post and the New York Times. So I think that's great that that kind of thing can happen.
Well, we're almost at the hour here, and so I'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Tomasky, for all your thoughts and for answering the questions from all directions. And I see we have a musical instrument behind you, so
We do. Yeah, you want me to play guitar on the way out?
hey, yeah, I can sign off. But so thank you again, and for sort of helping. My initial thought was to say crystallizing where the media stands today, but it seems like it's not so crystal as it is a cloudy
Yeah.
ball out there. But
Yeah,
hopefully
well, no, I know. Well, I want to thank you, Sherry, for asking me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in and hanging in. And some of you are saying nice things about me. That's very kind. I appreciate it. I wish I could have been more upbeat and given you better news, but there is a lot of good, tough, aggressive journalism still in the United States, and I think there will be through these 4 years. And I'd like to think that the New Republic is part of that. So come to tnr.com when you can. But other than that, support local nonprofit news, and let's someday this will get better.
well, we really appreciate your time, and to let those of you who are still online know that the recording of today's conversation will be posted to the League of Women Voters of Maine's website soon. And there are also recordings of earlier speakers if you want to listen to those, and certainly share the availability of these seminars widely within the League and your other friends. We also always have our little promo on going to the tip jar if you'd like to put in a small donation to keep this series going on, and to let you know that we are working on a February gathering, but you need to watch for details, and when these come out, please let others know. So thank you again for joining us, the Leagues of Maine, Alaska, and Colorado, and Michael Tomasky from the New Republic and other things. So
Cool.
bye for now.
Appreciate it. Thanks.